Hello, everyone. This is the next chapter of the Romans Bible study, chapter 3. Before we begin, let's start with the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natananu Mashiach Yeshua, v'hadbarot shel habarit chadashah, Baruch atah Adonai noten habarit hachadashah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who gave to us the Messiah Yeshua and the commandments of the new covenant. Blessed art you, Lord, giver of the new covenant. Now, chapter 3, verse 1. Then what is the advantage of being Jewish? But what is the benefit of circumcision? Much in every way. First of all, they were entrusted with the sayings of God. So what if some did not trust? Will their lack of faith nullify God's faithfulness? May it never be. Let God be true, even if every man is a liar, as it is written, that you may be righteous in your words and prevail when you are judged. But if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, what shall we say? God is not unrighteous to inflict wrath, is he? I'm speaking in human terms. May it never be. For otherwise, how will God judge the world? But if by my lie the truth of God abounds to his glory, why am I still judged as a sinner? And why not say, let us do evil so that good may come? Just as we are being slandered and some claim that we say their condemnation is deserved. What then? Are we better than any? No, not at all. For we have already made the case that all, both Jewish and Greek people, are under sin. As it is written, there is no one righteous, no, not one. There is no one who understands, no one who seeks after God. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. There is no one who does good, no, not even one. Their throat is an open grave. With their tongues they keep deceiving. The poison of vipers is under their lips. Their mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin and misery are in their paths, and the way of shalom they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Now, we know that whatever the Torah says, it says to those within the Torah, so that every mouth may be shut and the whole world may become accountable to God. For no human, on the basis of Torah observance, will be set right in his sight. For through the Torah comes awareness of sin. Yet again, Paul does not hold back in his words. No, he says, what advantage then does the Jew have, or what is the value of circumcision? At this point, Paul seems to be hearing an objection, as if someone is saying, if in order to amount to something, one has to be a Jew inwardly and must have experienced the circumcision of the heart, then is there any advantage of being a Jew in the broader literal sense, or being physically circumcised? Is there any advantage of all to belonging to the Jewish nation? And since ethnic background and the rite of circumcision did not make a person a real Jew, according to Paul in chapter 2, what benefit does circumcision confer on those who trace their lineage to Abraham? Now, many would have expected Paul to answer this question categorically, like none whatsoever. But he replies, much in every way. There is an advantage. Namely, they were entrusted with the sayings of God, the words of God. And even Stephen, who addressed the Sanhedrin in Acts, said the same thing. He said, living words to pass on to us. He quoted history to the Sanhedrin, which, if you read the account in Acts 7:38, the Sanhedrin did not like the fact that he reminded them of that, and amongst other things, and they ended up stoning him for it. Now, to have this revelation, the Jews were entrusted with the sayings of God, the Torah, the word, the scripture was given to them. It was a high honor indeed, but with that honor carried great responsibility. If they proved unfaithful to their trust, their case was worse than that of nations to which God had not revealed himself. Now we see evidence of that throughout, well, even the Old Testament, but especially in the New, they had perverted what God had given them and turned it into something that was never meant to be used, and were using it in a way that it was not meant to be used in. They were counting too much on their knowledge of the Torah to save them, and Paul in Romans begins to set that record straight. Now, of course, there are many passages that show that the Jews as a people have received this privilege above all other nations, such as Psalms 147:20, Isaiah 5:6, Amos 3:2-3, Matthew 22:1-8, Luke 13-6, and especially Romans 9, where the apostle returns to the subject and expounds upon it. Now, all of this had been entrusted to the Jews to be accepted by faith, obeyed as far as applicable, held in honor, and transmitted to others. That was the key. One of the keys right there is it was meant to be shared. And there were some amongst the Jewish community, namely certain members of the religious leaders, who did not think that the Gentiles deserved to be taught this knowledge, which is another thing that Paul and the Jerusalem Council would address as well. And when they finally came to the point to where they were willing to share this with the Gentiles, they put unnecessary requirements on them to even begin to do that, which is addressed in Acts 15. These privileges implied duties. Honor go hand in hand with responsibilities. Could it be truthfully stated that Israel had shouldered these responsibilities? Not time will reveal that as we go along. So, Israel had not proven faithful to this trust, and this might have been put as an objection when Paul argued that it was a great advantage to belong to the nation which had received the divine oracles. But his reply is that men's faithfulness never alters God's faithfulness, or excuse me, men's faithlessness never alters God's faithfulness or frustrates his purpose. God's purpose will ultimately prevail. Their unfaithfulness simply sets the truth in relief. His righteousness is always vindicated over against unrighteousness. Now, the fact that Israel had been blessed with many advantages cannot be questioned, and those who try to question it are in danger of placing themselves under God's curse and are just simply ignorant. But this does in fact consider by itself this that it does it guarantee a rosy future? No, as we see in scripture, Israel suffered because of their transgressions. Even if the Jews expect God's special blessing, they better be faithful to their trust. And we see throughout most of the Old Testament that wasn't the case. And even God warned them in so many words. He placed before them, you know, life and a curse, a blessing and a curse, life and death. He said, if you keep my commandments, you will consider life and blessing. If you don't, these are the consequences. And he even urged them to choose life. But they transgressed, which led to many, many, many years of problems, even to this day. So know, they failed to be if they failed to be a blessing to the nations, alike the Gentiles, their future is dark. Now, as in 2:21-33 is shown, something similar was true with respect to Israel. It too, despite all its privileges, had become unfaithful to its trust, and because of this disloyalty, God's name was being blasphemed among Gentiles. As a people, therefore, unless it should experience a radical change of heart, it could not look forward to a glorious future. The Gentile, the non-Jew, other nations were looking down on Israel because, from what they saw, God had abandoned them because of what they did, which we know God had not abandoned his people, but they were looking at what Israel had become during that time: constant exiles, occupations, war. And so that's all they had to go off of. Paul then posed a rhetorical question: what if some of the Jews did not respond in faith? Did their lack of faith cancel out the faithfulness of God? If my faithfulness sets God's if my faithlessness sets God's faithfulness in bold relief, if my unrighteousness establishes his righteousness, why should he find fault with me? He is really the gainer of my sin. Why should he exact retribution for it? Now, this objection seems foolish to Paul, that he apologizes for mentioning it. The answer is plain. God is the moral governor of the universe, the judge of all the earth. How could he exercise that function, which is inseparable from his Godhead, if he did not exact retribution for sin? If God did not act justly, he would not be God. And as a matter of fact, Paul, this is precisely what some people say my gospel amounts to, but their charge is not only slanderous, it stands self-condemned because it is such a contradiction in terms. The gospel of justification by faith apart from works is righteousness, has always called forth this criticism. But the criticism is amply refuted by the fact that the same gospel insists unequivocally on the fruits of righteousness which must follow justification. The very suggestion that God might become unfaithful causes the apostle to shudder. He exclaims, by no means, or let it not be. Perish the thought, God forbid. The expression occurs often in Paul's epistles, including chapter verse 31, Romans 6:2, 15, 7, 7, 9, 14, 11, and elsewhere. He says it a lot. Let God be true and every man a liar, or let God be true though every man be false. Now, the second clause may echo the psalmist's display outcry. Men are all of vain hope, Psalms 116:11. Let every human being be convicted of falsehood, rather than God's veracity be impunged. Now, by adding let God be true, which is also echoed in Psalms 119:9 and 116, Jeremiah 10:10, and every person a liar, Paul places divine veracity, faithfulness, and human unfaithfulness over against each other in a sharp contrast, and prays that the full recognition be recorded to the former. Human unfaithfulness does not nullify divine faithfulness. Those two stand in contrast to each other. Now, Paul adds the words taken from Psalms 51:4. Not only the words of Paul in Romans 3:4, but also of David, quoted from Psalms 51. Make God's righteousness stand out on the dark background of human sin, as the dark shadows In Rembrandt's misnamed Night Watch causes the spots of light to explode even more brilliantly, so man's unrighteousness accentuates God's righteousness. In other words, our unrighteousness makes God's righteousness more apparent. And since our unrighteousness brings out more sharply God's righteousness, should not the Almighty be happy about the turn of events? Is he not unfair when instead he inflicts wrath on man? With another, by no means, the apostle crushes this wicked type of reasoning. It is as if he were saying, "What? God unfair? How do you even dare suggest this? It is agreed, is it not that God is qualified to judge and will judge the whole world? Well then, how could he be unfair? Should not the judge of the earth deal justly?" Which is taken from Genesis 18:25. People today struggle with that same question. They don't like the idea of divine judgment. And scripture is clear that God will and is going, God has, will, and will continue to judge and will judge the earth. He judge everybody. Now, someone might object, if through my falsehood God's truthfulness is enhanced to his glory, why am I still being condemned as a sinner? Why not say, as we are being slanderously reported, some claim that we say, let us do evil that good may result. Their condemnation is deserved. Doing evil, thinking you're going to bring about good, does not work. And it brings about condemnation. That's like doing the wrong thing for the right reason. Now, why not do evil that good may come? It's easy to see how Paul's gospel could be misrepresented as though it taught this. That's why many antinomians think that Paul is advocating against the Torah, saying you don't need the Torah, do whatever you want because you've been saved by grace. But if you actually take time to study Paul and what he taught in its true context, one is hard pressed to uphold that belief because it is quite clear that Paul never advocated for antinomianism. He never spoke against the Torah at all. Now, he did speak about its misuse. He did speak about how not to use it, and he did speak about how to use it, and he did speak about its true intent, its true purpose. But he never said that you don't do it. Anytime he seems to be speaking negatively against the law, he's speaking negatively against how it's being used, not the law itself. The law, which is a very poor translation, because the word Torah means instructions. And in that word, you have ordinances, you have laws, you have commandments, and of course, instructions. So Torah is a broad thing. It's multifaceted. So it's very unfair and very inaccurate to reduce it to a mechanical sounding list of cold words, laws that you have to follow. That's not what Torah is. Even that's how people have used it, unfortunately, but that's not what Torah is. It's never been that. And that was Yeshua's whole underlying frame was he said he came to fulfill it. He came to show us how it was meant to be lived out. So if we want an example of how to follow the Torah, look no further than Yeshua, because he is the one who set the example on how to walk it out properly. He never did away with any of it. He came to uphold it and establish it, to carry it out, to make it known in its true form and its true intent. And even Paul later says the very substance of the Torah is Messiah. The Messiah points, the the Torah points to Messiah. Now, we can see how this is, like I said, misrepresented as though it taught this. Those, whether Jews or Christians, who regard religion as essentially a matter of law, however that word is interpreted, could not but conclude that a doctrine of justification apart from works of law undermined the place of law in mankind's approach to God, and therefore undermine religion and morality. He goes on to say their condemnation is just. This may mean either to condemn such men as these is surely no injustice, or such an argument is quite properly condemned. Now, the pronoun translated there may refer either to the people who say such things, or to the things they say. In the latter case, citation would be better rendering than condemnation. So, a more accurate way of saying, that is easily refuted. But either way, it's wrong thinking. Now, here are two rhetorical questions followed by a rust-raising answer. There is a close connection between verses 5, 6, and verses 7 and 8. If our unrighteousness confirms God's righteousness, if through my falsehood God's truthfulness is enhanced, see, in both cases the attack upon God's righteousness is repulsed, and his honor is maintained. His truthfulness is enhanced by our untruthfulness, and his righteousness is enhanced by our unrighteousness, which just shows why he is God. No human being can boast that. Now, there are also minor differences. Note the change from our unrighteousness to my falsehood. Why am I, etc. However, the first person plural returns in verse 8. In verse 7 and 8, the attention shifts from the condemnation of the attack on God's righteousness to the condemnation on the perversion of the doctrine of salvation by grace. Hence, there is a close connection between 3, verse 7, 8, and 6, 1. See, let us do it in evil that good may result. And 3:8 would let us continue in sin that grace may increase. 6:1. Paul, if you're not paying attention, Paul will rehash the same points, the same arguments in different chapters, but rephrase them in different ways or add different elements to them to address another issue that's connected to this one. So, as Peter says, Paul can be very difficult to understand. So you have to know what Paul is referencing and how he's speaking. He's speaking like a Pharisee because that's what he was. That's like today I guess you could equate his level to like a doctorate, PhD, whatever, a high level education, one who has spent many, many, many years learning and studying. And that was Paul. This opponent, this hypothetical opponent speak as if when Paul taught that a person is saved by grace, he meant go ahead and sin to your heart's content in order that grace may have a chance to do its work. And that's not Paul was saying. And to see more on the terribly destructive perversion of sound doctrine, you can see in Romans 6:1. The apostle concludes by saying their condemnation is deserved. He means those who flaunt this love will receive a just retribution. The people who so wickedly misrepresent the doctrine of we will claim will get what they deserve. Now, verses 9 through 20. It was now time for Paul to draw his argument to his logical conclusion. He asked, what shall we conclude then? The pagan, rejecting the revelation of God and nature and pursuing a lifestyle that was both idolatrous and degrading, was deserving of the wrath of God. See in Romans 18 to 32. The Jews who had the law but failed to put it into practice received no benefit from their privileged position. Romans 2 1 to 3. What does this all imply? Now, these words present problems, interpretations, and vary widely. The meaning, do we excel? Are we any better? Suits the present context, since the status of both Gentiles and Jews are very deplorable indeed, as has been described. Now, the NIV, which, like I stated previously, I'm not a huge fan of, nor is it a very good translation, but it takes the second option. Are we any better? This asks whether, in view of the dismal picture just painted, the Jew was in any way better than the Gentile. The answer is only in a limited sense. Now, here we go. The Jew was neither better off nor at a disadvantage, since it has already been established that both Jew and Gentile are under condemnation. The entire section reflects the courtroom scene, the evidence in verses 10 to 17, the courtroom setting in verse 19, and the verdict in verse 20. The conclusion would seem to be clear. What the apostle is asking is this: by nature, or of ourselves, are we, believers, both Jew and Gentile, better than all other people? We have a right in our explanation to add the words by nature, for the apostle has not yet expounded in any detail what we become by grace. The fact is, by nature, everyone is a child of wrath, and Paul makes that clear in Ephesians 2, 1 through 3. Now, to substantiate his claim that both Jew and Gentile stand accused before the bar of divine justice, Paul cited a collection of Old Testament verses. Once again, we hear the rhetoric of the evangelist as he urged people everywhere to recognize their need for salvation. Now, if he has borrowed this mode of argumentation from the rabbis, that surely cannot be held against him. The fact is that the material he quotes is relevant, well chosen, and inspired. So he goes back to the Tanakh to show that the issues have always been there, and what the result has always been, and what the fix to that problem is. Now, by far the most of the quoted material is from the Psalms, though the prophet Isaiah and writings are also represented. Does not this indicate that Paul regarded not only the historical but also the poetical and prophetical books of the Old Testament as being inspired? Yes, he did. Paul often referenced these books in his teachings. He referenced the writings, the prophets, the Torah, and even other Jewish literature of that time. The prime example of that is verse 10 through 12, when he says, there's no one righteous, not even one. There's no one who understands. There's no one who is searching for God. All turned aside together, they have become worthless. There is no one who does what is right. There is not even one. This verse quoted by Paul are not always exactly as they are found in Hebrew scriptures. I mean, he doesn't always quote them verbatim, but he does reference them quite a bit. Now, several factors may explain the variation. Some quotes are taken from the Septuagint, which differs somewhat from the Hebrew text. Also, a New Testament author would quite often, under the inspiration of God and to accentuate a specific point, adapt an Old Testament verse to serve his immediate purpose. And no one was better at that than Paul. Why? Because he was raised as a Pharisee. He learned from a very young age. Well, most men did, but he was specifically given to the Pharisee line of teaching from a young age. He learned under one of the greatest rabbis of his time. And so his knowledge was quite extensive. But if you notice, even though he had such knowledge, he never became arrogant. He was never arrogant about it after his. Now, I'm sure he was when he was still living a simple lifestyle, but after following his conversion, his whole attitude changed to where he became a very humble person and recognized the fact that he himself was still a sinner and was still and could still potentially fall away from truth. Furthermore, the practice of precise citation of scholarly knowledge is a modern phenomenon. It was not all that customary practice in antiquity. Now, Paul used this not to prove the lamentable state of those outside of Messiah. You will not be able to find even one just or righteous individual. No one has genuine understanding. If they fully understood the consequences of sin, they would not live as they do. By nature, people simply do not seek out or search for God. Now, this may seem like a surprise. People throughout the world are often pictured as seeking God through various paths offered by different religions. Paul would not agree. It is true that they may be seeking some sort of religious experience, but that is not all the same as seeking God. And even today, people are seeking new religious experience and have created a whole new religion called wokeness. First, it was political correctness. And over time, it morphed into progressivism. And now it's morphed into wokeism. And wokeism has actually been around a lot longer than people realize. It's just taken different names and forms over the years, and now it's right back to being called wokeness, which means they're actually asleep. And wokeness has become a new religious experience. It is a new religion. People worship at the altar of wokeness. They've replaced the truth of God for a lie. They have rejected God for their own gain. They have become their own gods. Wokeness is idolatry because it places self above God. It even places the people who follow it, place themselves above others as if they are superior to others and therefore think others should bow to them. Now, in verses 13 to 14, Paul cited passages that deal with the throat, the tongue, the lips, and the mouth. The ungodly display their fallen nature when they open their mouths to speak. It's an old saying, it's better to be thought a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt. Now, and Proverbs talks about how the fools are always the ones to open their mouth first. So they're fools. God provided us with the gift of communication so that we may honor and praise our Creator, and we tend to take that gift and place it in the service of our own sinful nature. Out of our mouths come both blessings and cursings. And we will be accountable for the things we say. The desire to prevail at any cost leads to suffering and disaster. Evil inevitably overreaches itself. It creates the conditions for its own collapse. And in moral universe, wickedness earns its own sentence and personal retribution. The way of peace is unknown to those who turn from God. Their lives are marked by unrest, a lack of genuine satisfaction. They live out their days haunted by a dim vision that there must be something in life that would satisfy their deeper longings. They do not venerate God or hold him in esteem. That was the issue then, and it's certainly the issue in today's world. Everyone's seeking self-satisfaction. They're seeking things to satisfy the flesh. And in doing so, they bring about their own destruction. And it's all because we have free will. God gave us free will. And what we do with that determines our outcome. So don't blame God for your bad decisions. God didn't do it. God didn't make you do it. God didn't force you to do it. God gave us free will because he loves us. No one likes to be controlled, right? In fact, if God controlled everything, if God interfered all the time in human day-to-day life, that wouldn't be very loving, would it? What what do we tend to call people who try to control and manipulate others abusive? When someone's trying to control you all the time, that's considered abuse, right? Not love. You don't control people you love. So if God was controlling every little aspect of our lives, yes, he knows everything we are going to do. He's seen from beginning to end. He knows what choices we're going to make. And because he loves us, he allows us to have that ability to choose between good and evil. And he does offer a way for us to escape the consequences of that evil. But he doesn't make anyone accept it. He offers it, but he doesn't force you to accept it. And so those who continue to make those choices will inevitably meet those consequences at some point, all because God loved us enough to give us free will. So those who end up condemned have no one to blame but themselves. Now, Paul's Jewish audience would have known that the law was applicable only to those who were under its jurisdiction. What they apparently were not aware of was the law placed them in a defenseless position. Rather than providing access to the favor of God, it served to silence any attempt on their part to argue personal righteousness. The law spoke to them so that no one may have anything to say in self-defense. Along with the Gentile, the Jew would be held accountable to God. The whole world falls under the judgment of God. The Torah, the law, was never meant as a way to gain salvation. It was never meant to be used as a way of gaining God's favor. It is there to help keep us in good standing with God, but it's not there to offer salvation. So words must be interpreted within their context, which is as follows: that every mouth may be silenced, and the entire world may be exposed to the judgment, or may stand guilty before God. Now, the apostle is no longer thinking exclusively about Gentiles or Jews. No, he is summarizing his argument, combining the conclusions to which he has arrived in connection with Gentiles, Jews, and everybody, including believers, as they are by nature. He repeats the verdict expressed earlier. Now, the figure used is dramatic, fear-inspiring, unforgettable. Everybody is standing in front of God the judge. The records are sealed, and as it were, one by one, the accused are given an opportunity to answer the charges made against them. However, their guilt having been exposed, they have no answer. Their mouths are silenced, stopped. When we stand before God, we have to give, and we will give an account, and we will be judged according to our words and actions. Now, it's a hard pill for some to swallow. Many people, many believers don't, well, unbelievers too, don't like the idea of God being a judge. See, like, oh, God is love. Yes, God is love, but he's also just. And there are many scriptures about how God will judge And you can skip over them all you want, but that doesn't do away with the fact that they're going to be in there. Now, Paul's argument is irrefutable if you take time to study. By the works of the law, no one can ever be justified in God's sight. Why not? Well, consider for a moment what the law demands. Nothing less than this, that a person love God with all his heart, soul, mind, and strength, and that he loves his neighbor as himself. The two greatest commandments, which summarizes, let me say that again, summarizes the law and the prophets, meaning if we love God and love others, then we are able to carry out. That's how we display our devotion. If you take time to study the Torah, you'll see that there are commandments, instructions, ordinances on how to demonstrate our love for God and how to demonstrate our love for others. The whole central thread of the Torah is love. That's why it says, if you love me, keep my commandments. And the apostle has shown that it is exactly this love that was lacking on the part of both Gentiles and Jews. He has made it clear that every person stands condemned before God. So what the Torah really does is show people how sinful they are, for through the law is full knowledge of sin. Now, Greek, hamartia, corresponds to the Hebrew chet. Both are usually translated sin. Both also convey the same sense, missing the mark. The word Torah comes from the Hebrew word yara, which means target, to an archer shooting an arrow, the mark. So Torah is the mark. And when you sin, you miss the mark. It's an illustration, an analogy, an archery. You lock the arrow back, you release the arrow, and you hope you hit the target. And if your aim is sure and true, and your hand is steady, you will hit the target. If you miss the mark, though, well, then you weren't steady, or other outside circumstances. But it's an illustration. Like an archer who shoots off target. Thus, what the Torah gives to anyone who lets himself be affected by it is ever fuller awareness of how much he's missing the target of righteousness, which the Torah sets before him. The Torah is our guide to righteous living. It does not bring about our righteousness, because our righteousness is imputed to us by God, but it is our guide to live out the righteousness, and it shows us how to live out our righteousness. Now, this is not the Torah's only task. It also provides guidance towards right behavior. Torah conforming. The Torah, when you conform your life to it, will show you exactly how to live your life in a way that is pleasing to God. Now, he stands condemned because of sins of commission, but also of sins of omission. Not only because of his sins open and public, but also the ones he commits in secret. He is damned with not only God's sight, not only because of what he says and does, but even because of what he is, that is because of his sinful state. By our sinful nature, we were condemned, and those who continue in sin are condemned unless they repent. Now, there are people out there that believe that sin doesn't separate us from God, which is a lie. Those who walk in sin are condemned, meaning the only conclusion to their sin is ultimately death. But there is a way of escape. God provides that gift to those who accept it. And once you accept it and let your life be transformed and begin to walk in his commandments, he gives you right standing. God provides all the tools that are necessary for the walk of faith. It's just up to us on whether we want to use them or not. So those who don't use them and reject them are condemned, and those who fall away will fall back into condemnation. And God's soul will take no pleasure in those who shrink back. Now, the only one conclusion is possible. Therefore, humanity is doomed. Doomed, doomed, doomed. The condition is one of thorough hopelessness and despair, and the law, with its demand of nothing less than moral and spiritual perfection, a state to which humanity in our power can never attain, creates a dreadful, mortifying sense of sin. Hence the present presentment of doom, total and everlasting. Now, Paul has made his case. People have turned from the knowledge of God, revealed in creation, and degraded themselves. The Jew who has the law has not obeyed the law, and is therefore no better than off than the Gentile. Both Jew and Gentile fall under the condemnation of sin. They have all missed the mark. Is there hope? In the verses that follow, we will be introduced to the righteousness of God, a righteousness that has nothing to do with our performance, but everything to do with God's provision in Messiah. Now, Paul's whole point in this chapter, or in this, especially in this first half-ish, is that Jew, Gentile are all in the same condition. We're all guilty. We all stand condemned. But there is hope, and Paul goes on to explain that. But one is not, and one group does not have an advantage over the other, and Paul has made that point very clear. And to think otherwise is to insult God. So, with that thought, we will end with the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan lanu hadavar ha'amet, v'chayei olam hatabatukenu. Baruch atah Adonai, noten ha'brit chadashah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who gave to us the word of truth and planted everlasting life in our midst. Blessed are you, Lord, giver of the new covenant. Well, thank you for joining me in this study. And I believe I mentioned it last week, thanks to technical difficulties in Zoom, no longer accepting streaming to this page for some reason. I will be pre-recording the messages and posting them as they go along until I'm able to find the solution. Also, next weekend, I will be away. I'll do my best to post things as time permits. I'll have the Bible studies already pre-recorded and posted, so that way we keep going, and not really have to delay it any more than I have. So anyway, I hope you all have a great evening. Be blessed, be safe, and I will be back in a couple of weeks.